Right. Good Thursday afternoon to you. Welcome to the Wiley Report, and I am Wiley. I'm so excited today because we're honored to have as our very first podcast guest, Professor Christina Carney. Professor Carney is an assistant professor within the Department of Women and Gender Studies at the University of Missouri. Her areas of research specializations include Black feminism, Black sexualities, queer color of critique, U.S. West Studies, and critical ethnography. Broadly, her research centers on the relationship between racialized gender and sexual difference and the construction of nature and region. I introduce to some, present, and welcome to many, Professor Carney.
Hey, thank you for having me on, you guys.
Yes, so glad you're here. A lot of your work discusses intersectionality. So for those that hear the term, don't understand what it means, or just wonder what does it mean in relationship to your work, how would you define intersectionality?
Well, intersectionality it's really interesting. So it's a term coined by legal scholar, Black feminist, critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw. And she used it. She was actually working on the ground and working with immigrant women, women who are undocumented, poor Black women. And she ran into some difficulty with trying to explain the materiality of their experiences, particularly within like the courtroom and like legal spheres and spaces, right? And so she coined this term intersectionality to talk about the intersecting identities for women of color, poor marginalized women, right? Mm-hmm. So usually in the court system, because she's a legal scholar, people look at it as in terms of anti-discrimination, if you're discriminated against because you're a woman, or you're discriminated against because you're Black, right? Mm-hmm. And she saw there was like really no room to talk about the intersection of both, right? Okay. So she's thinking about it in terms of these intersections, and a lot of people after her have included other identities to consider in terms of thinking about sexuality or ableism, and a host of different like identities that people should consider when we're thinking about how power operates.
Okay.
So how I use it in my work. So my work is on Black sex workers in the US Southwest, specifically San Diego. And I look at it in terms of how like Black women use deviance, even though they're like seen as like these very deviant individuals. They actually use deviance to kind of resist some of these constructions of their sexuality. So I look at working class Black women who are sex workers, who are sometimes very transient in terms of, them being in certain spaces, like not being from a certain space. Let's look at how power operates, especially in relationship to like a city which is imagined as being white. So when you think about San Diego, you think about the beaches. You don't really think about Black communities compared to spaces like Chicago or Detroit. Right. Or even Los Angeles, even though that's a very white space, right? Relatively to other places. So so that's how I'm thinking about intersectionality, and I teach intersectionality here at Mizzou. I always start off with Kimberly Crenshaw, and then I just have a host of other different readings and assigned texts that I incorporate to kind of think about like disrupting this idea about just thinking about women, just thinking about gender, but just thinking about all structures of like power that impact people's materiality and like everyday experience.
Okay, cool. So what issue, because you went into my second question, so thanks without you having asked it, yay. But the third question I have is, what issues do you see in how intersectionality is discussed? You can either focus on it, in research, or just confine it to GWS, Gender Women Studies, so either one.
Yeah, so I think Jennifer Nash's book talking about Black feminism and intersectionality has like really opened up, these critical discussions about, one, who gets to claim, the term intersectionality, right? Did it come from Kimberly Crenshaw? Thinking about Brittany Cooper's work, did it come from women in the early Black women in the early 20th century, right? So it's a lot of discussion. It's a lot of like territorialism around the term intersectionality. I think it's more important, and it's more productive to think about what it actually like does, right?
Okay.
And then when you think about intersectionality, you also have to think about how it's been like corporatized and
Mm-hmm.
used by the university for IDE and, like this multicultural type of like discourse, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even though it's been like very like productive for a lot of women on the ground doing activist work, and also even in the academy, I think, certain institutions have like co-opted it for their own like political and economic um goals,
Right.
right? So I
Right.
think it's really tricky, right?
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that I tell my students to think about is like, don't think about it in terms of like who has a stake on terms of like the keyword, right? But think about, how power operates. It's not just about diversity and having a Black person and, a LGBTQ plus I plus person, things like that, but thinking about how power operates, right?
Right.
Um, and then it's also this, discussion about how intersectionality should just be used to analyze like Black women, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's something that Nash opens up. So it's important to think about like Black women and the work that Kimberly Crenshaw did, but she also did it with like immigrant women too, right? So I think a lot of times women in gender studies, a lot of departments, if they have like an intersectionality class, they're like, "Ooh, check mark. We got our diversity X, Y, and Z." But they're really not even thinking about intersectionality in terms of like their own institutionalization as a women in gender studies, you know, um,
Right.
entity, right? So
Right.
we have like the token Black person to teach intersectionality, but other people in the department don't incorporate intersectionality into like their work, right?
Right.
And a lot of times our work as Black feminists is like devalued compared to like other people, or it's not seen as nuance with
Right.
like people that do like transnational studies X, Y, and Z. So I think that's another thing that Nash talks about too, that we need to like open up intersectionality because it's very like US centric and like focused, and think about it like more like globally as well. So we can have like more nuanced and critical discussions about like race.
Right. Because in thinking about that, the question becomes, how do you do what steps or advice would you suggest to do that? Because I hear that a lot. I just took a class last semester by Professor Toby Beecham, Intersectional Pedagogies. So we talked a little bit about some of these topics, but not a lot. As well as I took Race and Digital Studies by Professor Brooklyn Gibson, and we were talking about race and digital studies. But just I bring that up because even when you bring up race, sometimes, or you talk about DEIA, or it seems like some of these topics are silos, or at least they're siloed off. So how would we make these broader discussions, and thinking of this as grad students who will someday at some point either doing their own mogul abilities in their areas or industry or in academia, what would be a way to make these areas less nuanced, in your opinion?
So it's interesting. As it relates to like the fields that you're going to be in, right? So it's easy
Mm-hmm.
for me as a women and gender studies scholar to like kind of like bring up intersectionality as something that's just not just a class or your diversity requirement, but something that we all need to incorporate like in our work, right?
Right.
I think doing conferences, bringing scholars to universities to think
Mm-hmm.
about it. So like one conference, it was related to intersectionality, but that wasn't like um, the name of the conference. But in my second year here at Mizzou, I did a conference called "This Is Not Your Grandfather's Black Studies Center in Pleasure and Anti-Respectability as Methodology," right?
Okay.
So I use I think it's important to kind of like use the resources of the university, which is a business, which is an institution like everything
Right.
else, but
Right.
kind of use it to your advantage, right? So even
Mm-hmm.
though like sexuality studies, intersectionality, all of those frameworks are devalued in the humanities and also in the ivory tower, I
Mm-hmm.
still was able to use those resources to bring scholars who have an investment in Black sexuality, Black sexuality as a field and as a politics, and also scholars who like also engage intersectionality, because those two, you know, go hand in hand as well, together to like really discuss and talk about this, right? So there are ways to work within like these very rigid institutions like the university to still have very like productive like conversations, right? And I did that in my second year, right? And then because the fields are sometimes like very so small and XY, people are willing to come. Like you having a conference on intersectionality and strategic communication. Nobody talks about that at the big conferences. Yes, I'm gonna come to your conference that you're doing at U of I, and you know, resources that you have there, and have like these robust like intellectual like conversations, right? So I would just say like start like really small, and then out of that, from that conference, I selected some people to do a special series in American Quarterly, right? So not only did we have like the conference, we also got a publication out of that I'm also going to use when I go up for tenure next year, right? So yeah, it's about we're like restricted and like confined in like these institutions, but like finding ways to like kind of like resist or find some semblance of freedom is, you know, possible.
Right. Two questions that I had from that is, in thinking of what you said, as far as like starting conversations, one, who would be the target audience of this work? And two, in thinking of, okay, you can start the conversation in terms of conferences, in terms of institutional support. Does that conversation change if you're talking about non-academic spaces, if we're talking about funders and government? Is there a way to do that similar message and still achieve the same goal? That makes sense?
Yeah, I think that's what people call like strategic like essentialism. So I'll start with like your last point first. That's the one I can remember. So start with that one. So yeah, so like, you know, so for example, you're not framing it in terms of like women and gender studies or like Black studies, right? And you're framing it for, I think you said like government or X, Y, Z. You know, us as scholars, we're in this profession to learn how to write and kind of be like kind of subversive with like the kind of like work that we do, right? And just thinking about your like first question in terms of how do you create like who's your audience? I think that's what you said, right? So it's interesting because here at Mizzou, I'm the only person who does Black sexuality at all. Like I'm the Black sexuality, Black sex person, Black gender person, like that's it. And I kind of also wanted to, so of course I wanted to like have my people come here and, you know, we talk about, you know, the field, but it was also a way to like show like the larger community that we are a community, right? And we're having like these very rigorous discussions, and people were, you know, reading papers on a host of different topics, right? And people were really interested in that. They were like, you know, like they didn't either value Black sexuality studies, they didn't know what it is, right? And we opened it up to the community, right? So we had a segment on like the local NBC talking about it, and you know, we really encourage people to come to the university, and some did, but most of the time you don't get that, right? Especially if you have it at the university, right? So maybe next time we do a conference like this, we'll have it in like a more like community like oriented space, so people won't feel so intimidated coming to like the university, right? But then also, again, going back to your last question about like how to frame it, yeah, I think people who are not in like my field, who are in more, you know, feels like government or like law, they're the people, like if they're talking about and using intersectionality, they are the experts in terms of how to craft it for their field, right? In terms of like law is pretty easy because I'm thinking about Kimberly Crenshaw, and she was a legal theorist, right?
Right.
So there's a lot to pull from there. And then also thinking about government, for example, you gave that for an example too, like, having these conversations, like, what are we doing in terms of intersectionality? Why is it problematic that it's used for IDE? Like you can have those provocative conversations, right?
True.
So that's and when you think about the institution, like, this is why we're here. Like, we're here to like produce knowledge, debate. Like, this is what we do for a living. So if you're in space and people are reluctant to do that, then that's a problem.
Right. True. I agree. Last question. What advice do you have for graduate students in terms of writing about race, gender, and class?
Oh,
like notes from the field. What would you tell them?
People think this is like easy, but you have to think about everything all at once, right? And I think it's important, especially when people in like traditional disciplines, to also go outside of your discipline, right? So when I was an undergraduate at the University of Illinois, I got my degree in interdisciplinary studies because I was a women and gender studies major and an Afro-Am like minor. So I never had experience working in like a traditional discipline, but I was just in my writing group right now, we were saying like, because we do interdisciplinary work, we have to like incorporate different methodologies and analysis and like frameworks, like everything. Like, so my work is like literature, geography, ethnography, historical methodology in terms of archival research, right? And so I think like looking outside of your field is like important, right? Because when you're in a field, you're really guided by like the methodology, right?
Right.
You're like thinking about it an interdisciplinary way, you're more motivated by your research question, right?
True.
So like, what methods do I need in order to answer this question about Black sex workers in San Diego, right?
Okay.
And I think that's really important. That's how you get like more nuance in terms of like how to think about this, and also how like traditional disciplines have also been very complacent in reinforcing like anti-Blackness and these like discrete objects of analysis, for example. So the disciplines still have always had issues and will always have issues. And that's why it's been great that like Black studies, African American studies departments have kind of like challenged that linearity and that normative idea about thinking about like knowledge production. So I would just say like work outside of your field, continue. Like, one thing that I'm noticing in like my university is that, one, because graduate students majority are forced to like work in like their first 3 years, they don't have a lot of time to like go to presentations by folks that the university is bringing in. Like, always like be thinking about like, well, what's going on in this field, or how can like this scholar about who's talking about post-coloniality, how can I incorporate that in my work, or how can I negotiate that, right? So just keep being like intellectually like curious and don't stop reading.
Right. Yeah.
Don't be complacent.
Right. Can't be complacent. Keep it always reading and always learning, because I'm learning in my own experience that I'm not going to get to solve anything, which that's not the point of research. And then at the same time, well, you're providing solutions, but you don't necessarily get to control how people will do that. You can say, hey, I can bring this knowledge and say, oh, perhaps you should think about it this way, but I might not necessarily be involved in the this way. That I just provided, so I get that.
Right.
And I think it definitely, it seems like it always leads to more questions. So it's like I started here and then I have 9 more questions that I didn't have at the beginning, but that's the point. So it's been really encouraging to talk to you and empowering and great to see you. And for all those watching, we will see Professor Carney virtually next Thursday, 3 p.m. You can come watch with us in 126 in University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign over in the old Information Science building. I call it old because we also have a new building too. But it's great to see you. Thank you so much for participating. You have a great day. Peace.
And isn't it 3:30?
3:30. If I said
Okay,
3 o'clock, my bad. 3:30. 3:30. You have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.